Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got an interesting gentleman to introduce you to tonight. Renzo DiCarlo. He is the CEO of Biopharma Services, a clinical research organization headquartered here in Toronto. Biopharma was established in 2006 and conducts clinical trials of first-in-human generic and novel compounds on behalf of pharmaceutical companies worldwide. Headquartered in Toronto, Biopharma Services is the largest privately held medical R&D facility in Ontario. It's got 300 beds and lab machines in Toronto and St. Louis, making it a major contributor to drug development around the world. Renzo has been involved in the biopharmaceutical and life sciences industries for over 25 years and has extensive international experience, having lived in North America and Europe with significant business dealings in Asia and Africa, having held numerous positions in nuclear medicine, lab testing, cold chain, and human drug development. We'll find out a little bit about all of that. But in addition, SARS to COVID-19 has resulted in both Renzo, Biopharma Services, Inc., and 250 of their medical professionals in Toronto and St. Louis becoming prevention, testing, treatment, and management experts in the fight against COVID. And so I'm looking forward to listening to hear what he has to say. Sir, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Good, Brian. Thank you for having me on your show, and it's a pleasure, and lots of stuff to talk about, and thank you for a great introduction.
You're welcome. So how did you get into the pharmaceutical testing business?
It was actually by accident. I'm originally a mechanical engineer by training, and I ended up working in Ottawa and joined MDS, and originally did nuclear medicine. From there, I went into the lab business and found a great group of doctors who founded Biopharma here in Toronto. And we've just gone together as partners, and we've developed this company into a significant R&D medical company across the world. We actually work with about 200 pharma clients around the world, and that actually gave us a really good insight on COVID early on in February, because a number of our Chinese clients were in isolation and were being affected by SARS version 2 early on. And a lot of our doctors here also practice in many hospitals across the GTA.
Have you been doing any clinical trials into the vaccines?
We did some therapeutic work, but not the vaccine per se. We actually were in talks with Providence very early on in March, because we did a press release in March where we volunteered our clinics for the fight against COVID. And Providence and a number of other clients actually approached us early in those days. They were still very much strapped by funding. You probably heard Brad Summerson talk about funding that he needs for Providence to get to the next stage, since they're setting up a manufacturing site in Calgary. But at the time, we were actually giving them a little bit of advice on what to do before, when they were doing their preclinical work on their RNA compound for the vaccine. And they've actually gone with a company to actually do their studies now that can do phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And we're very much specialized just in phase 1. But it was a real pleasure getting to know them early on in March and being able to give them some scientific guidance and review their protocols while they were in the preclinical stage.
You know, one of the interesting things that several people have commented about is the juxtaposition of how quickly we've developed, the scientific community, not we personally, but we collectively, the scientific community, have developed vaccines, but there hasn't been, it would appear, a lot of development of therapeutics. Why do you think?
Well, there actually have been. I think it's more along the lines that it's not mainstream or sexy. A lot of the media has been focused more on the vaccine, whether it be a live vaccine or dead vaccine, a partial vaccine, or an RNA compound, which is what Moderna, Pfizer, and Providence are working on. But there are actually a lot of companies working, and we're actually working with some of them, that are working on steroids or autoimmune suppressions. And they've got great ideas of using existing drugs to be a therapeutic agent. So the community is actually learning quite a bit One of the indications of how well we're doing actually is, even though wave 2 right now in Ontario is significantly higher than wave 1, you'll notice that the amount of death rates are significantly lower. And that's because the doctors and hospitals know how to treat it better now. There's early signs, there's prevention, and there's also those steroids and autoimmune management tools that are being developed, that are being used. I mean, case in point, as you know, President Trump was actually one of the candidates that used the antibody type treatments at the time. And those treatments continue to be developed as they speak. They're just not being showcased as mainstream as you might think.
What are some of the autoimmune therapies that are being used?
So it's things that a lot of products that you would use for example, organ. So we work on, for example, certain therapies for transplants, and so that to suppress the immune system. So essentially it's drug products that are essentially managing that cytokine reaction. So you've probably heard of the cytokine reaction word, and those tools kind of suppress the immune when you have that overexertion of the immune system on the fight.
Yeah, it's interesting. The term that they use is a cytokine storm.
Correct, yes.
Sort of gives you an impression about how this overreaction is like a storm.
Yeah, and you get that in certain diseases that you may be aware of, like sarcoidosis, or even skin diseases that you have are similar to that cytokine storm or cytokine storm that you would have. So it is essentially a storm, because your immune system is taking over, and it's not just fighting the disease, but it's actually attacking your healthy cells. So being able to manage that immune response for people that have those immune response problems is very important.
Separate from your presidency of Biopharm Services, I understand you're an Ironman.
Yes, I kind of fell into that. When I worked at MDS, I assume you and others may be, and your viewers or your audience might be familiar with MDS. It's actually known now as Life Labs and SciEx. There's a number of MDS companies. Another one was in Ottawa, it was called Nordion, and managed all the isotope productions around the world. And at the time, I wasn't in great shape. I'm actually in better shape now than I was in my 30s. But at the time, MDS sponsored a 10-kilometer run in Ottawa, because I used to live in Ottawa. And so I thought I might as well try it. I had a training program. The company had coaches. So I got bored of a 10K. I then ran, I decided to skip the half marathon and do the full, the Good Life, a full marathon here in Toronto. That was back in, oh my goodness, 2001, 2. And then, I couldn't swim. So
couldn't swim, and now you're doing Ironman.
Yeah. So, I ended up doing a whole bunch of marathons around the world just because I wasn't fast. So I decided to do different marathons around the world. And long story short, at one point, a friend of mine said, why don't you try an Ironman? I'm like, I can't swim. I can probably do the bike, but I can't swim. So stupid me, I decided to teach myself in a pool. So I did the half Ironman in Muskoka. I almost died. Probably was the third last person out of the water, made up on the bike and the run. I finished the half, and then I signed up for the full Ironman in Penticton in British Columbia. And I realized at that point, I better hire a coach. And the guy who saw me swim, my coach, he's part of the C3 triathlon club in Caledon. He's like, I don't know how you did that. You only swim with one arm. So it was the funniest thing. But I actually decided to dedicate a lot of my Ironmans for autism charity. And I ended up in Hawaii doing the Kona Ironman eventually. And I finished it, and I raised $50,000 for autism. My daughter, Rachel, one of my daughters has autism. So because she can't do those runs, I do it for her. And it's been a great journey. It's been a lot of fun, and I can combine medical and personal and so on and so forth. So
awesome. We're chatting tonight with Renzo DiCarlo. He is the CEO of Biopharma Services, a clinical research organization here in Toronto. We're going to take a break and come back more with Renzo in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Renzo DiCarlo, who is the CEO of Biopharma Services, a clinical research organization here in Toronto. Biopharma, established about 15 years ago, 2006, conducts clinical trials of first-in-human generic and novel compounds on behalf of different pharmaceutical companies. Renzo, how has the pandemic, COVID-19, impacted biopharma?
That's a mixed answer. And an extremely good question. I think early on, we were learning as much as the entire industry. And I think biopharma had the advantage that we have clients in China. We actually have Chinese clients in Wuhan as well. And so early on, before the Western world was waking up to COVID-19, we were beginning to monitor what was going on in China. And we actually established certain matrices with our nurses and doctors here of when to start implementing preventative measures. And so fortunately, biopharma was actually ahead of public health, ahead of the federal and provincial government, and very much matching what was going on in Asia based on what we learned in China. Obviously, for both our employees, our patients, our volunteers, it was a scary time, but we were able to sort of give them matrices to say, at 200 cases in Toronto, that's when we're going to start implementing social distancing. That's when we're going to start expanding our clinics. And it's when we decide what type of testing to do for our staff or volunteers or employees and so on and so forth. And then finally, after that, we were also able to determine what kind of measures to put in place before public health imposed them on us. And it actually kept us open. So Brian, we were one of the few privately held R&D centers that never shut down.
Oh, really?
Because we were proactive. We ran through the first wave. Running is probably not the right word, but you know what I mean. But we functioned through the first wave. Our volume did take a little bit of a dip as some of our major clients were scared and nervous, didn't know how to react, didn't know what was expected, especially our US clients. But when we showed them that we had almost 7 COVID procedures already implemented by the end of March. So procedures like disinfection, deep clean, masking, when to use an N95, when to use a surgical mask, when to use a cloth mask. We had already debugged a lot of that by the end of March. We also talked about, flow of people through the facility. Which way should they walk? How do they separate by 1 or 2 meters? Even now, we have measures in place that are much more strict than public health. So for example, public health will tell people to go back to work after 2 weeks of their COVID positive, and after the symptoms have resolved. We will not take anyone back until we see 2 negatives in a row, 3 days apart. And we've stuck to that rule.
Why 2 negatives in a row, 3 days apart? Because of false positives?
Because of false positives, because of the fact that there could still be underlying disease there, because of the fact that you could theoretically be reinfected. So many factors. And we've had case after case, both good and bad. So for example, we had one of our employees that we isolated back in April, and we isolated her because her mother worked in a long-term care facility and she was COVID positive. However, this employee knew how to stay safe. So despite the fact that she lived with her mother, she never tested positive.
Really? That's interesting.
We've also had employees that come back with a negative, and then we test them again and they're positive. And then we test them again and then they're positive. So everyone is learning. One of the local Ministry of Health, labor people came in for an inspection about a week or so ago, just like they've been doing for big box stores. And we walked her through and we told her about all the measures, and they're learning as much as we are. So in some cases, we're trading information with the government and with other private companies to help them out.
I had an interview with an emergency preparedness expert who said that our close downs and our physical distancing and mask and other public health measures weren't nearly strict enough and stringent enough, weren't anything comparable to what happened in Asia. But then they went on too long. And his argument was, by not being as strict and as stringent as what was going on in Asia, we end up, by definition, not being successful, having to go on longer, and then it's ineffective because people get bored and fatigued with it. What do you think about that?
So that's absolutely correct. Like some of my other colleagues in industry, I've written many letters to the federal government and the provincial government, not just offering the help, but giving them advice. We have a great relationship here with the federal MP, Judy Scrow, and we wrote letters to the assistant, to the deputy minister, Christian Freeland. And back in March, April, my comment to her in a letter was, you need to shut down interprovincial travels now. And what are we doing? We're talking about shutting down provincial travel today when we should have did it in March, April.
But at the same time, it looks like we're opening up schools in a week and businesses sometime soon. That's
right. So there's so many angles and there's so many things that can either make the virus spread easier or less. And I think that we require a concerted effort for everybody to work together in thinking. But your interviewer from the other day is absolutely right. We should have been like Taiwan and like Korea. We should have been more strict back in March and April to squash the wave. Same thing goes now with the second wave. If we had stopped a lot of our measures back in early December, that second wave would not be as big. And there will be a third wave, I'm sorry to say. So
when?
Sorry?
When? This spring or next fall?
I would say probably based on the way the virus behaves, and if we reopen schools, because schools are a big source of infection, despite what people say. If you're not measuring and people are asymptomatic and children are asymptomatic, they're spreading it with each other. They bring it home, they bring it to the parents, they give it to the grandparents. And I would say that we're probably going to see a third wave, probably close to mid-April to the end of April. Hopefully more people will be vaccinated to lower the fatality rate and manage it better. But until we're all working together, federal, provincial, private sector together, this is a complex jigsaw puzzle. I mean, we're making the flu and the cold virus extinct. That's a joke, but there's a huge reality to the fact that the cases are extremely low because the R0 transmission value of a flu and a cold is significantly less than COVID and the COVID variants, right?
So this emergency preparedness expert that I mentioned earlier is worried that this UK and particularly the South African variant are far more infectious. And he also thinks that you are infectious, asymptomatic far longer. And so therefore the time period for the potential incubation is there's far greater risk.
And that's absolutely true. And I think that's the reason, for example, I have one employee that I've currently isolated since December 6th. She traveled abroad. She came back, COVID positive, end of December, still COVID positive, but no symptoms. Public health is saying, take her back. I'm like, no, no, no. We're still checking her. At the end of January, she's still COVID positive. Now she's great.
How can you be COVID positive for 2 months?
Because it's that lingering virus that is still replicating in your body, but not making you sick because your immune system is keeping it suppressed. And a lot of viruses work that way, where there's a low viral load, but they're not making you sick, but that doesn't mean you can't transmit. Just like vaccines, we can be vaccinated, but that doesn't mean we can't still transmit. You can still transmit. And so the variants that are easily transmittable, that's how they're spreading until they hit someone who's vulnerable. So again, we need to take the approach, and we should have done this back in April last year, protect the vulnerable. I mean, there's many people that have been talking about that in the media. We failed the vulnerable. We failed the long-term care facilities. That is something that we need to do better on.
The long-term care impact has been a tragedy. If you were in charge of that, what would you have done?
I think back in March, April, and these are some of the recommendations I gave to government officials, is I would have used the military right up front to start creating them like biological centers to increase that improvement, to require the testing, no different than what we're doing at the airport. Need a PCR molecular biology test before you enter the airport, before you fly, same kind of thing. And do it earlier, because once you have a case in a long-term care facility, it spreads very easily. And as you said, Brian, there's a lot of those variants that are moving around now that are faster. So we need to make these long-term care facilities almost like biological centers, where you have to assume everyone's immunocompromised, and you have the stages to get into them, and the 100% PPEs, with the full gown and so on and so forth.
I was told that after SARS in 2003, that there was a judicial inquiry that took a look at the impact on long-term care then, and made a lot of recommendations comparable to what you're sort of suggesting, and none of them were implemented.
No, and I think the same thing goes with 1918 with the Spanish flu. Back then, they talked about social distancing. They talked about masking in the US in 1918. People complained about using masks. They did it again now. And it's almost like we have long-term memories, but also short-term memories. And we forget very quickly. So I hope that when this pandemic is under control, that we won't forget, because my worry is that these variants will become new strains. And the WHO is right when they say until everyone's vaccinated, no one's safe. So if you have a country that is creating new variants because the virus is not under control, eventually that variant will become a new strain. The virus mutates every time it transmits and increases the chances of variants. Fortunately, right now, the vaccines are good at managing variants, but when they become a new strain, you need a new formulation on the vaccine. And so that is the key to success here, is we need to not forget the pain points of 2003 or 1918. We need to make sure that just because things are good for a couple of years, that we maintain that healthcare standard for our long-term care facilities, not just now, but in the future.
So is COVID-19 or the coronavirus going to be around in just new variants for forever?
Yes. I mean, it will be better managed. The fatality rate will go down, hopefully, to the same level as the flu, where it's 0.1% or 0.1%. But with vaccination and with social distancing, I think we're going to get back to a normal. It may not be 100% the same. Maybe it'll be 80 to 90% similar to 2018-19. but I think it's going to be here to stay. It's a coronavirus, just like the flu and the cold. What we need to make sure is we manage the next pandemic that could arise from this virus. This virus actually doesn't replicate quickly, but it does spread. It has a high infection rate. And if you don't manage it, those variants become new strains.
What do you mean it doesn't replicate quickly if it is so infectious?
It actually doesn't replicate as quickly as the flu and the cold virus. It has a high infection rate, but it's not mutating. Sorry, I should have used the word mutating. It's not mutating as quickly as the cold and the flu virus. So that's why the RNA vaccines from Providence and Pfizer and Moderna are effective for a couple of years because the mutation rate is not as high. But when we don't control the virus and it's spreading rapidly, because every time it transmits to somebody, it mutates, it can create those variants that then take over in the population, right?
We're chatting tonight with Renzo DiCarlo, who is the CEO of Biopharma Services, a clinical research organization here in Toronto. We're going to take a break and come back more with this gentleman in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight and having, I think, a really interesting conversation with Renzo DiCarlo, who's the CEO of Biopharma Services. It's a clinical research organization, often referred to in the industry as a CRO, clinical research organization, headquartered here in Toronto. And what they do is they do studies of pharmaceutical products, clinical trials of pharmaceutical products that are sort of first in man, human, generic and novel compounds on behalf of numerous different pharmaceutical companies around the world. He's got 300 beds and lab machines in Toronto and St. Louis. Why Toronto and St. Louis?
So Toronto was basically based on our founders. So there were two doctors who originally created Biopharma, and they did quite a bit of work in Rouge Valley as well as Scarborough. And they originally, before they set up Biopharma, they had a very much a lucrative practice in site management. So they have a great connection here in Toronto, great connection with UHN. And that's how we ended up having our first facility here in Canada in the GT area. And we're very close to a number of major companies here like Apotex, AstraZeneca, Roche, these type of firms. And over time, we decided we needed to expand our footprint beyond Toronto into the US, predominantly because we do a lot of controlled substance management, and we do a lot of pain, anesthesiology type work. And so because of DEA that doesn't like exporting controlled substances from US manufacturers out of the US, we decided to set up a site in St. Louis. And Missouri, St. Louis has very much a similar culture to Toronto in terms of very much hardworking people. They have a great medical community down there. And we actually have a preferred relationship with the US FDA. So we won a $20 million contract with the FDA to be their preferred R&D site. So it's kind of unusual where a regulatory body is also our client. And so that's how we ended up in St. Louis for those reasons.
And when you're doing clinical research, I presume that you've got healthy volunteers that are coming into your facility to voluntarily take experimental drugs that are in clinical trials and see if they work or not. With COVID-19 and all the government protocols, you must have a really good sense about how people are feeling about what's going on. What's your sense?
So yes, we do, because we do deal with the public, and we probably have 200 to 300 subjects, volunteers entering our site every day. And essentially, the public, the volunteers, subjects, patients, nurses, doctors, people are nervous, they're scared, they're uncertain. I think it's safe to say it's similar to what you and I might be feeling. What's the future? Is there going to be a third wave? When will this end? How will we get back to normal? Will there be a normal? Can we celebrate Easter together or Ramadan? Or can we, can we do the normal things that we used to do without feeling like it's Groundhog Day every day, which, as you know, was last week. So there goes, everyone's feelings span from nervousness to fear to the economy to everything altogether. And quite often it has been hard to manage. And I think the best way to reassure people and to make them in a better position is just constant communication. So people need to talk. People need to talk about it. People are tired of Teams calls or Zoom calls. They want that physical, emotional interaction. Even with some people that have daycare or children at school, there's that conflict between, do I send my kids to school or not? Do I want my kids to have that social interaction versus do I want to increase the risk of infection? So everyone, it's top of mind, and I think people are exhausted and people are worried about their economy, their pocketbooks. You know, the nice thing that I have is when we bring in volunteers, many of them have sent us letters and thanked us for the opportunity to continue having a revenue stream when in some cases they're out of work because they used to be in the hospitality industry and they don't have work, or they used to work for the airlines and they've decided to do clinical trials. So very, very mixed feelings.
So maybe unfair, but as I mentioned earlier, I used to be somewhat exposed to the clinical research business. And a lot of the volunteers were people in the lower parts of the socioeconomic strata. And so I think you're probably very exposed to people that have had income challenges, that have had employment challenges. And, you know, that group is, it would appear by the statistics, more susceptible to COVID-19, probably because they're still being forced to travel on public transit and go to work, and they may not have the best health. So if you're seeing them scared, that's probably a pretty good example of how people are feeling.
Yeah, the one good thing is that many of these volunteers, before they enroll in a study, we do a full, not just a full questionnaire on their health, but we do a full physical. So quite often, if the doctors don't feel they're healthy or if they might have COVID, we actually don't enroll them in the study. So often they're actually safer in our building than they are going to a big box store or a grocery store. And because of the measures, I mean, we have electronic facial recognition thermal scanners, similar to the airport here. We also do full blood work on everyone before they're enrolled for a study. We isolate them before they enroll for a study when we do their physicals. In some cases, we're using 2 or 3 masks and face shields as well. So I think a lot of people who enroll are actually feeling, they are scared, but actually if they need to get out and if they want to do a study, they might be more reassured coming here than going, for example, to a public location.
Right.
Case in point, we do studies, women's health studies, and we have to enroll postmenopausal females for those studies. And they're nervous because of their age bracket. I mean, I won't mention what that age bracket is, but because of their age bracket, they're on the nervous side versus a 20-year-old. However, we've been able to reassure them that it's safe, but it takes that communication. It takes showing them the protection and the social distancing.
One of the most impressive things this past year is how quickly the vaccines, or at least some of the vaccines, have gone through clinical trial, through research, formulation, and clinical trials. Where some people were saying it would take a couple of years, and that seems to have been done in a couple of months. How did that happen, and should we feel comfortable with the process that seems so quick?
So how did that happen? It happened in mostly because governments around the world were supporting their local manufacturers. And the RNA vaccines, for example, were always in existence before, just like Providence existed before. And I'm focusing on Providence because it's our RNA vaccine in Canada. And Providence actually developed that technology for cancer therapy. So Brad Summerson, one of the CEOs and founders there, he was developing it for cancer therapeutics because he had a passion for it. However, when they saw the virus, they realized, just like Moderna and Pfizer realized, that they could pivot that technology into vaccines. And so fortunately and unfortunately, the market demand for a vaccine and the amount of people that it was needed for expedited RNA technology. That is amazing. I am super excited, especially being in the clinical research field, that we're going to have so many different RNA compounds being used for other viruses, for cancer. This is a huge breakthrough, and it came because the attention and funding that the governments gave all these companies because of the immediate threat and the immediate need. Now, is it safe? They've gone through their early stage research. They've gone through their late stage work. They've had tens of thousands of volunteers and patients they've treated. So statistically, it appears based on the current data that it's safe. Everyone should become knowledgeable in the vaccines they're taking. But from my perspective, even though it's expedited, or in the US, they call it Project Warp Speed, it's still safe. They've gone through the regulatory processes.
Can we take a step back? Can you explain to me and to others the difference between this RNA vaccine and a more typical vaccine?
Sure. So an RNA vaccine is actually, I can go into a lot of the scientific, but I'll keep it very high level. The RNA vaccine is stimulating your T cell immune response. So what it's doing is, as you inject the protein or the spike, because what you're doing is replicating the RNA spike from the virus into your body learns to make that protein. That protein then creates a response from your T cells, which is your immune system. And so it trains your immune system to say, hey, I have the protein. When I see the virus, I already know the protein, then I will stimulate the antibody response. Whereas the traditional vaccine is typically using a dead virus or a modified virus or a replication of the actual virus itself versus the RNA protein that is being, or the nucleic acid that's being put into your body.
Do you think these vaccines are effective? What about all the people that are worried about taking them? What's your advice to them?
So they are effective. Clinical studies are showing the RNA vaccines are 91 to 96% effective. Some of the other more traditional vaccines from AstraZeneca and J&J are, 65 to 82% effective. I think if you're healthy and you don't have any concerns, they're perfectly safe. Is there enough data for certain specialty populations? Probably not, but I think in those cases, you need to review it with your physician and get an opinion. I would say that they're safe, especially I would encourage it for long-term care people that are vulnerable. My parents are 86 and 83. I should know that exactly. I would recommend it to them. I would also recommend it to my loved ones, and I'll be more than happy to take the vaccine when it's available to me. I am not in a rush because I believe that the more vulnerable people should have the vaccine before I take it.
But one of the interesting things that you're saying, and obviously this has been said by others, but I think you've expressed it well, is that even after you take the vaccine, you can get the infection and you can pass on the virus to other people. So you're not stopped from getting the virus. What you are is the virus is then killed, destroyed by your immune system, and you don't get sick. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that's why I'm a huge advocate of tiered down or tiered up, or whatever the expression might be. Focus on your elderly first, your immunocompromised. Don't vaccinate people below 60 until everybody above 60 has been vaccinated, or above 70. So start from your long-term care facility downwards, and that should be your priority, because you can still spread. And there's no point vaccinating 20-year-olds right off the bat when they can still spread it to 70-year-olds that may not have the vaccine yet.
We're chatting tonight with a gentleman who runs a clinical research organization here in Toronto, Renzo DiCarlo. He is the CEO of Biopharma Services, a clinical research organization that studies and does clinical trials on drugs and vaccines in development, first in human trials. So he knows a lot about what he's talking about. We're talking about COVID-19, and we're also talking about his business. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us.
No problem, Ryan.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Renzo DiCarlo. He is the CEO of Biopharma Services, a clinical research organization here in Toronto. He's also an Ironman, even though up until a couple of years ago, he didn't swim, which is astounding to me that he taught himself how to swim in the process of becoming an expert in an Ironman. So that's got to tell you a little bit about this man's resilience and tenacity. Mr. DiCarlo, you obviously are expert in this business, given your experience with running Biopharma Services. You've got a lot of very relevant points of view and knowledge on COVID-19. What do you think the lessons are that we've learned so far in the way that we've fought this virus?
So I think the lesson is that, we're in an unprecedented time, but at the same time, we also have experience from the past. I mean, the word quarantine comes from the Venetians, 40 days. They used to force the ships to sit on the docks for 40 days before coming in because of that pandemic at the time. 1918, people debated masks or no masks, social distancing. I found a letter from a BC mayor the other day in 1918 asking people not to use the pool and not to have more than 10 people in a gathering. So we're repeating the past. We've learned, but we haven't learned. We have short memories and we have long memories. And so what we need to make sure that we don't forget is how to protect the vulnerable in the future. Yes, we should have did things a year ago faster, but it's not too late. There's still a lot of people we need to protect as we roll out the vaccine. There are going to be new variants and new strains. We need to learn from what we've done in the last year and apply it for 5 to 10 years. The other thing that I think many of your viewers and people that listen to your radio show, Brian, would know is that Canada needs to retake a certain amount of its sovereignty back. And I don't mean sovereignty in a geopolitical way. I mean in a healthcare, life science way. We need to make sure that our PPEs and our manufacturing are in Canada. There's a certain amount of protected manufacturing in Canada for when we need things that we can mobilize quickly. That know-how. We're very resilient, multicultural people. We are people that produce. And, I love being in Canada. I love being a Canadian. And I think that we need to make sure that lessons learned, we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. We focus on the things we can do, which is set up the proper healthcare, private sector and government and hospitals working together to protect our people and protect our healthcare for the future.
So I spoke with a CEO of a PPE manufacturer last week, and he said much the same thing, that supply chains globally had been ruptured during COVID-19, and we really needed to have a domestic source of PPE and other development. And he said the key was long-term contracts with the federal government, because he says that they had produced it actually 15 years ago for SARS. And they had some contracts, but then the contracts all dried up as governments and corporations went for the cheap products from China, until the cheap products from China were no longer available and they needed to supply it from Canada. And he said that the problem is that people forget too quickly how important domestic production is, and they go for the cheap alternatives that are only available in good times, not when you need it.
That's right. I actually did a master's at London School of Economics, and I got the opportunity to work with a professor in the US, Dr. Freeman, who went to Duke, and he's a big believer of stakeholder theory. And Dr. Freeman says that communities only thrive when you have government, charities, NGOs, media, all the stakeholders together, working together. And this pandemic is showing us that in Canada, we have fragments in our stakeholder theory. So if we were doing well, it's not just the private sector, it's not just the government, it's not just the charities and communities. Everyone has to work together as multiple stakeholders so that we can work as a cohesive unit, almost like the obelisk of the past that Japan used to set up. And we have to do that in Canada as well.
But we appear to have a far lower per capita infection rate and mortality rate than the United States. So we're doing something right. Is that not correct?
That is 100% true. And we'll have to see what happens with the Biden administration, if that changes or not. But exactly true. In Canada, we've done a great job compared to the US policies, which were a lot more lax when it comes to social spread. Their domestic airlines are still flying everywhere all the time.
You know, several people have warned in the past couple of years about a coming pandemic, and we didn't listen. Do you think we're going to have another pandemic in the future?
We are, by definition of the word pandemic, but I think it's going to be less serious. I remember in the summer, there was an outbreak of a avian flu, I believe, and people were concerned that virus would spread across the world from China as well. And, it's not specific to China, but when you have 1.5 billion people, the odds of them having a virus are a lot higher than when you live in a country of 33 million people. But I think we're going to have future pandemics. However, I think this has taught us well on how to manage things in the future. And I think governments will clamp down very quickly next time around. I mean, even for the 1918 Spanish flu, if they had the airline industry in 1918 that we did, the Spanish flu would have been a lot more serious. It was a serious pandemic at the time, but airlines and the ability for us to fly all over the world quickly makes spread so much easier.
We're chatting tonight with Renzo DiCarlo. He is the CEO of Biopharma Services, a clinical research organization. We've had a good, frank conversation about his company and COVID-19. Mr. DiCarlo, I understand that you also have a final word you want to say about loneliness and mental health.
So I think the pandemic is not the only thing that is affecting us. I think it speaks to myself and other people. People are tired of the isolation. It's great to do social Zoom calls with each other with a glass of wine or a coffee or things like that. But we're tactile people. We need touch. And I think in the future, in years, we're gonna have reports or broadcasts about the people that were forgotten, people that had extra depression, or that there were domestic issues at home. And I believe that we need to take care of our mental health as much as COVID-19, and we need to be kind to each other. We can't forget our humanity. And that is the message I want to close with.
Be kind to each other. Don't forget your humanity. Renzo DiCarlo, CEO of Biopharma Services, thank you so much for joining us. That's our show for tonight. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you.